Got it.
Okay. So I know part of who you are personally and what you're transitioning into professionally is really all about helping families and communities, and specifically helping dads and their relationships with their daughters. And so I was hoping you would really talk to us about, or at least talk to me about, what is it that makes a good dad? And what is it that really dads or parents need to do to kind of impact their children in positive ways that would help their children think about their future in a very positive way? Now, that sounds kind of vague, but I know you've got some thoughts on this, so I'd like to hear about them.
Yeah, that is an open-ended question, and but you also know I do have a lot of thoughts on that as well. One of the things that I talk a lot about as a father is leadership. And there's a couple components to leadership. One is knowing yourself, your strengths, your weaknesses, your nuanced attitude in certain spaces. And the other part is providing a vision and having goals for your family to include your daughters. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about the leadership perspective from a knowing yourself. I mean, that is something that everybody needs to look in the mirror. They need to reflect on how they were raised and understand what they've learned through life, through their job, through their relationships. I want to focus a little bit more on this concept of having a vision and having an aspiration for your family, particularly your daughters. And I'm going to dovetail, if you're okay, Keith, a little bit into the STEM space as well with some specific stuff that I did from a probably a science and a math perspective with my daughters.
Okay.
And so, first off, when you're a young parent, and you're particularly, I say young parent because that means your kids are young, right? We become parents when our kids are born. At a certain point in time, you transition from nurturing them and babying them and getting them to walk and talk to raising them to be adults. And however you define when adulthood is, whether it's when they hit a certain age or they hit a certain achievement, and then however you define the aspirations associated with adulthood. For me, a couple of them was raising a functional independent adult, which means that they're not dysfunctional and they're not dependent. So they can go be good citizens, they can carry on a career, they can pay their bills, and they're not relying on me for the basic necessities of income and making decisions. And that was something that I aspired for my daughters. And therefore, I went about when they turned around 5 or 6 to be very deliberate and forthright in raising them to be functional, independent adults. And therefore, you have to project where you want them to be and what are things that you can do or need to do between the time they're 6 and the time they turn, let's say, 21. So you have that 15-year period where if you're leading your family and you're leading your daughters, you are doing things to help them become, in this instance, functional and independent. So I believe that's a huge responsibility we have as fathers, as husbands, as leaders in our family. And so to that end, I kind of had something in mind for my daughters from an educational perspective, and is a little bit biased. And I'll tell you, I relented on this when they became, I think, juniors in high school. But my undergrad is in chemistry, and so I'm
Really?
a chemist by education. I don't know if I'm a chemist by experience because I really didn't do any chemistry after I graduated from Georgia, but I have a chemistry degree. I'm a certified chemist dating back to 1993.
Cool.
And so for years, my viewpoint was my daughters need to be in math or science, particularly science, because there's a lot of benefits to that, analytical, how you align yourself into the workforce. And we can talk that later if you want. But I had this position that they need to be scientists or mathematicians. I also understood that I had young girls, and young girls, if not young Black girls, typically struggle with science and math. It was just back when I did research, decades ago, that was just sort of a natural place where girls struggle with science and math. And so one of the reasons for that I found was a lack of confidence. It wasn't that they didn't have the aptitude to do it, it's that they didn't have the confidence to do it. And the confidence built up to a point where it trumped their aptitude. And therefore they just went into a different direction. It's the old travel the path of least resistance. So they moved away from science and math simply because their confidence or lack of confidence precluded them from doing that. Well, if my mindset is I want to have daughters who do science and math, and the key impediment is confidence, then what do? Affect their confidence. How do I affect their confidence? I decided to do summer math and science programs on my own. I mean, I always loved algebra. I'm obviously a chemist, so I understand science. So when they were in middle school, so before they actually got to high school, so late elementary for my youngest daughter, middle school for my oldest daughter, I think it was about a month, so 4 to 5 weeks, a couple hours, 2 days a week, we would do math and science. And I would teach them algebra, and I would do the whiteboard. I'd give them assignments. They'd have tests. I'd grade them. We'd talk about it. If their cousins came, so my nephews or nieces happened to come during that time, guess what? They were sitting in the class. They were doing it too. And you ask them now, they'll remember doing it, however long it was. And so therefore I did that so that whenever they took the class, and it could be 1 or 2 or 3 years later, because I was doing stoichiometry, which is a form of chemistry, when they were in middle school, and they weren't taking chemistry until 11th grade. But I was introducing topics and subjects and content that demanded that they make sense of it. I could also see how resilient they were. And then obviously by the end, they overcame it because they had a measure of success and they were introduced to things that they were not going to be introduced to for a couple of years. Well, that investment during that time meant that when they got to 10th grade or 11th grade and they started taking, whether it's algebra or geometry or chemistry, confidence wasn't the issue. Confidence was not the bar that precluded them from investing in math and science. And it's just an example of having an aspiration and then taking actions in order to enable them to achieve the goal that I had. And then I always say at a certain point, you hand the baton off. You hand the baton off where they now have their own personal goals and aspirations, and they're equipped to actually realize that, unbeknownst to them, that you set the conditions for them to be in that position when they were single digits. That's kind of a long answer, Keith. Hopefully that gave you appreciation of one of the things I think about leading your family and raising your daughters.
Actually, it does, and it does that perfectly well, because you really, impressed upon how important we are as parents. We need to set that bar because our children aren't going to know. If they don't know, if they don't have the confidence. And I know with my daughter, she struggles with projects. When she's given a project in school, and projects are very linear in nature, they're structured, have lots of different components, and then there's lots of different instructions. You give that to somebody, and the immediate response, especially with my daughter, and we've had to work with this, is don't look at it at the big picture, because it's the big picture that scares her, right? It's all, I got to do all of this. Let's break it down. And so it sounds like, we know that, as dads, we know that. And when you were in that position to say, yeah, these are the things that you're going to come across. So let's build up that aptitude, that confidence. And not only that confidence, because you can have a confidence in one thing, but not have confidence in something else, only because you've not been exposed to it. So what you started to do and reinforce with your daughters is exposing them to the things that are coming, so that by the time they face them, they're not afraid of them, which is really good. So that I applaud you. But STEM has been, as you just said, you are a chemist, but that's not the only thing you're good at in terms of what we call STEM: science, technology, engineering, and math. So can you talk to us a bit more about how all of that is part of who you are?
Yeah, so some of it harkens back to my military experience, and then prior to that. So I've found myself navigating the STEM space probably for 30 years now, whenever you kind of look at what the letters indicate. So one of the things, and this was why I went into chemistry, I didn't consider myself a chemistry geek or nerd. growing up. I didn't have a chemistry set. The funny backstory is I aced chemistry in high school. And the thing that probably put me over the top was it was a 2-day final. And since I aced it, I was exempt from the final. But I'm in high school. I had nothing else to do. So I took the first part of the final. And I didn't take the second part, but I still had the third highest grade of everybody in the class. And
From only one part?
I took one day, one part, and I think it was either number 3 or number 5 highest final collective grade of everybody in the class who took 2 parts.
Wow.
And so I had this, when I went to Georgia, I had to figure out what my degree was going to be. And I'm like, hey, well, I did pretty good in chemistry, so I'll choose chemistry. And, I had a couple of crucible moments where I wasn't quite sure. I always tell people, you take a class in college eventually where you're really going to find out whether that's going to be your degree or not. My roommate, who's a lawyer now, was going to be pre-med, and he didn't make it out of chemistry 101. And so I navigated through, and I made the decision about midway through to go from what was considered a Bachelor of Science with an emphasis in chemistry to a BS chemistry, which is a certified chemist. So I took a lot of chemistry. It was painful my senior year, but I took a lot of chemistry throughout my college years. And then I chose to go into essentially the chemical core. So in the Army, they have a branch that's called the chemical core, which does nuclear, biological, radiological, essentially training, development. They also go to a lot of things with some of the islands where you're talking about radioactive and deactivation of certain things. There's a lot into that technological piece with regard to chemistry that I went into as an officer. And so I did that for about, I think, 8 or 9 years. I worked in the chemical core, and I did, like I said, you go through live agent training, you understand biological warfare, you understand nuclear targeting and radiological, all that stuff that goes with it. So, but I didn't consider myself a chemist because you're doing almost more training and development than you are the technical piece. So I did that for almost a decade, and then I switched and became a research systems analyst. So those who don't know what a operations research systems analyst is, they're kind of high-end problem solvers using statistics and probability, or companies will use them to figure out manning models. When you're going to have the attrition, you need to bring in and recruit different people. You could do it for large scale logistics and supply chain management, different ways of moving things over air, land, or sea to get there. So there's a lot of, high-end calculation in the math space, as well as just problem solving from okay, now we're in a space, how do we deal with this operationally so we can get to the end state? And that's kind of the 2 ways I always describe research systems analysis. You actually get an operations research master's degree. Funny story, Keith, I did not go for an operations research degree because for me to stay as what they consider an operations research systems analyst or an ORSA, you had to get a master's in either math, science, or OR. And OR is sort of that combo I talked about. Well, my experience from Georgia, because I decided to switch from that BS emphasis in chemistry to certified chemist, my senior year, I took nothing but chemistry, and like some of the hardest chemistries, physical chemistry, upper level inorganic chemistry, organic chemistry, all the labs, and my brain was fried. I just, you can imagine, if you could, I don't know if you can or can't, if you can imagine, it was a lot. And so I'm done. I'm not going to do math or science as a master's degree. So I did the military training to be an ORSA. I decided to get my master's in adult education, which serves well now in a lot of stuff I do. But I did, years later, switch to what's called simulation operations. Well, simulation operations does modeling and simulation using flight simulators, using large scale models to project and solve problems, simulations, which is models over time. So you're doing these large scale division and corps, which are thousands of soldiers and Marines and airmen and Navy people fighting in a space over the oceans or on combat. Well, you can't do that in real world, in real life. So you create simulations to replicate that so that leaders can make decisions off of that. But there's obviously a technological underpinning to make all the algorithms and make all the ones and zeros and all the movements make sense. If you think about Halo and all those video games that a lot of the people play now, it's essentially using that, but using it to effectively train formations. And I've done modeling and simulation for probably about 15 years. That's where I ended my career. So if you look at the trace from 1989 or 1987, 88, when I took chemistry, to 2021 when I retired, I've existed in a science or a technology or a math space, not as much engineering, in different forms or fashion for a while. So that's my background and my exposure to STEM.
And it served you well, I assume.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in the big part, if you go back to when I chose to be a chemist, a little bit is, are you a chemist because you want to be, or are you a chemist now that you completed, all the classes in chemistry, right? So I always had an analytical piece to me. Algebra, I used to love algebra. I probably loved algebra more than chemistry. And so when I look at how it has served me, even separate from the actual degree and the application, it's really the mindset. It's an analytical approach to how you solve problems. It is grasping different parts and pieces of information and making sense of it to serve a purpose. And I've sat in rooms where you have a lot of people who are social scientists, and they kind of like to talk this abstract philosophical. And then I come in from a very much more scientific background. It's like, look, I understand we can pontificate for 20, 30, 40 minutes, but at a certain point in time, we've got to get that intangible into something tangible and practical that we can apply to get to a solution. And that's just, those sort of thoughts are what resonates, because that's kind of what you are taught and what you do. And then as you get older, you just take that and morph it into the situation that it may apply, even if it's not a normal traditional one.
Well, I appreciate all that. And then even some of that went over my head, and I think that's okay. But now I want to talk to you about really the focus here, and that's really getting STEM education into the K-12 school systems. And not that it's not there, but there are schools out there and there are kids out there who are really don't get the exposure, don't get the resources, don't get the hands-on experience. And that's really, for all intents and purposes, that's really a problem. And you know that, and I know that. So now what I'm trying to do, and with your help, we want to put those resources into the hands of kids, into the hands of teachers, and into the hands of schools. From everything that you've just talked about personally and how it's impacted your daughters, what are your thoughts in maybe just a couple of minutes on how would it impact if we really did and we were able to get it into the hands who right now don't have those resources available? How do you think it would change them and change their futures?
Yeah, I think it would be significant to the kids individually, and I think it would be exponentially impactful to our nation, and then you can even say within societies, however much you want to scale it up. Because when you look at it, I think there's two parts. There's the intangible and the tangible. And the intangible is the mindset, let's say. It's the attitude. It's to what you don't see, but it's what's in your head. And that generates that desire to innovate. It generates the desire to solve problems, regardless of how difficult they are technologically, time and space, engineering, whatever it is. But your mindset is, I'm going to take this on. If I have a vision and a desire to do something, I have the mindset, I have the attitude that I can do it. I'm going to solve the problem. I'm going to apply, whether it's scientific approaches, whether it's analytical ways to look at it, whether it's just me thinking out the box. But my attitude is one of overcoming. And there's a lot, if you look at kids, you look at generations, that sort of energy and mindset is transformational. One that says, I'm going to overcome. I'm going to learn, do more so I can overcome. That is what you want every child to have. We always talk about resiliency. You want to talk about circumstances, situations that could overwhelm someone or put them in a negative light. If you have a cohort that has an attitude of overcoming, of problem solving, then you all of a sudden switch the approach. Instead of all obviously being defensive and reactive, now they're offensive and they're attacking and they're resolving and they're functioning with that level of confidence and belief that needs to be reinforced by schools, by parents. So that's one part. That's the intangible piece. The tangible piece goes into actually exposing them to what is in the realm. What does this look like? Because, you know, I always talk, you can talk abstract and philosophical and you can sort of imagine it, but at a certain point you can't. And when you're younger and you maybe see something or maybe heard something, it doesn't necessarily get you to the same point of actually bringing something into the school, you know, showing them, you know, open up the hood or behind the, you know, what's on the front end, how does this work? And then have people that say, look, I was just like you. I was just like you, and this is what I learned, and now I can do this. It isn't some magic that all of a sudden I just poofed up. I started as a 7, 8, 9-year-old. I learned these different things, and then when I became 20, 25, whatever the age is, all that translated into my ability to do this because I had a mindset and an attitude, and then I was able to deal with this. And so when you can expose the youth to what can be realized from a technological perspective, from an engineering perspective, you know, from a science and a math, and you talk about applying those. Now they take their mindset and their attitude and they connect it with, okay, I can see not only me doing something like that, you know, I see somebody else who looks like me who also did it, and I have an attitude that I can overcome, and I have a mindset because I'm being told that, look, you are smart enough. You need to get the confidence because you can do this. You put in the work, you can realize the success. You know, you just got to put in the work to realize the success. And then we need to identify whenever they have those attributes, when they have that desire, when they have the acumen or the aptitude, like we talked about, that we put them together so that they can actually get that, and then it builds on itself. So I think that that's sort of the two parts. You know, how do we get the schools and the parents to invest in that? Keith, I think that's what you're trying to do. You know, there's a primer. You know, everything that goes out there, something has to spark it. And I think your ability to get into schools to show them this is what's in the realm of possible, to talk to them about that mindset, that motivation, you know, talk to the parents about how do they reinforce that. Some of the stuff I was talking about earlier. What are things that they can do to make sure that they don't squelch the motivation and the excitement from their child in a space that they may not be comfortable with, but actually facilitate it, enable it, and propel it so that they become more excited, you know, and more invested over time. And that's stuff that I think that we need to go and we need to bring in the experts. We need to get the FaceTime, and we need to help inform them so that they can contribute and have that transformative impact.
Eddie White, nobody have consented better than you. That was perfect.